Again, my name's Peter Christoph, and I have the pleasure of chairing this seminar, which is the second, I think, for the Melbourne Climate Future Seminar Series so far. Before I begin, I'd like to acknowledge that we are past and present. And now to the seminar itself. I think all of you here will be aware of the fact that when you really want to make sense of climate negotiations, just follow the money. And when you begin to look at the large climate negotiations over the last 30 years, leaving aside the traumas of Australia, a lot of the debate about finance has shaped the ways in which those negotiations have progressed. Initially, the tensions between the developed and developing world, in particular with developing countries deeply anxious about what sort of development was going to be available to them, and therefore seeking both compensation and assistance to deal with mitigation and that new decarbonised path. And then as the reality of climate change began to hit in the early 2000s, additional concerns emerged, in particular about funding adaptation, particularly amongst developing countries, the global south being largely not responsible for the impacts they were experiencing that time and through into the future. And then, of course, most recently, with the issues of loss and damage. All of those things, I think, over the last 30 years have become a very important sub-narrative. The finance narrative has been a very important sub-narrative for the history of climate negotiation, but it's been relatively unrecognised. So I think that we're particularly fortunate in geography and in the Climate College and MCF to have two very fine scholars who've been working in this space. I'm hoping that all of you managed to see Pia Treichels' wonderful seminar last year. She and Alistair Self, and Alistair's presenting today, together, I think, provide a very, very important contribution to the history and also the prospective development of climate finance in very different ways. So without saying any more, I'd like to hand over to Alistair, who's going to be talking about institutional dimensions, the history of climate finance. Alistair.
Thank you very much, Peter. Just share my screen for those online. Okay, is that working, Peter? Or you might not be able to see. All right, great. Thanks, Peter, for that introduction and for really giving a lot of detail about my seminar to prepare you all for what's to come ahead. I'd like to thank you also for being my supervisor over 5.5 or so years now, and Celia McMichael as well. You've been very patient and allowed me to go at my own pace, despite the university's reservations with that pace at times. I'd also like to thank all my colleagues at the Climate and Energy College and Melbourne Climate Futures who've been very supportive through ups and downs. We've been through a lot together, and acknowledge, of course, the people of the Kulin Nation upon whose land this seminar is taking place. Sovereignty was never ceded. Okay, so this is my seminar as part of completion of my thesis, completion of my thesis, gradual and transformational change in the financial mechanism of the UNFCCC. Now, I had a fair bit of trouble, as I'm sure most do, trying to squeeze an entire thesis into a 30 or 40-minute seminar. So I hope I've got the balance right in what I'm about to present to you. But apologies if the breadth and depth balance is off. I'm essentially going to take you through most of the thesis by first looking at the research problem. I'll then go through the theoretical approach I've taken, some considerations there, the research design I used for the thesis, and then some findings and conclusions. Okay, feel free to jump in with questions at any time. So the problem. The primary focus of this thesis is, as Peter said, the institutional framework for climate finance under the UNFCCC. So this problem came out of a desire to know where the Green Climate Fund in particular came from, why it existed, and why its particular institutional attributes were present, particularly given that there was already an existing organisation, the Global Environment Facility, that existed prior to the Green Climate Fund, and also why this all happened at the particular time it did, and how these events unfolded. So the main forum through which this occurs is the climate negotiations, and it's the main object of my study. So often when I mention to people climate finance is my broad thesis topic, they might start to think of the business faculty or finance or accounting or all sorts of things. It can be quite a misleading term. Climate finance is described in literature in one place as local, national or transnational financing, which may be drawn from public, private or alternative sources for measures or infrastructure to mitigate and adapt to the effects of climate change. So it's a very, very broad term. What I'm particularly interested in is in this small, move my mouse over, hopefully it will serve, this small box in here, the UNFCCC financial mechanism. So this particular diagram is just showing public financing from developed countries, going through all sorts of intermediaries and eventually to developing countries. I'm only interested in this one particular small segment. And that was quite a difficult early choice I had to make in order to be able to grasp the research, because it's, as Pia will know and through her seminar, a very complex area. So the financial mechanism was established at the inception of the UNFCCC under Article 11.1, as indicated on this slide. And Yamin and DePledge offer a useful way of defining the financial mechanism that I've employed in my research. And they state that the financial mechanism is the totality of legal, institutional and procedural arrangements that regulate and make possible the flow of financial resources mandated by the convention. So within that definition, they also include COP decisions, agreements, etc. Not just the organisation of the Green Climate Fund or the GEF or the entity operating it. It's a much broader conception of climate finance. As I mentioned at the beginning, the inspiration for this research was sort of driven by why the Green Climate Fund was established and why it was established at a certain time. The Green Climate Fund is really the central entity of the financial mechanism that I've been studying. It's known as an operating entity. It's joined the Global Environmental Facility as a second operating entity. However, the financial mechanism also, using Yamin and DePledge's definition, includes all of these other aspects. So these all fall into my research. But naturally, the Global Environment Facility and the Green Climate Fund serve as key loci of the research. And there's a quote here from Richard Kinley, who is the Deputy Executive Secretary of the UNFCCC, from a thesis interview, and he explained to me that the Green Climate Fund, it really is light years different from what one could have ever envisaged in the early days of the launch of the climate finance discussions. It shows that, as he's eminently exposed to speak on this, and the differences that occurred in this time are massive. Particularly given the arguments that have happened within the climate finance space. So I've just got here listed a group of what I call sub-issues of climate finance. There's been arguments largely along developing lines over all these issues within climate finance. Who should pay for it? Who should it go to? What instruments should it be? Grants or loans? Who should govern all this finance? What modalities should it flow through? And these have caused enormous amounts of tension within the climate negotiations, as Peter said earlier. Okay, so that's just to give a little bit of background. I'll speak now on my theoretical approach, and it is of institutionalism. And this is an appropriate body of work to use to approach the thesis, because it is interested in understanding why and how institutions change. It did emerge out of domestic political analyses, but more and more it's been used to look at international relations problems. And in this approach, institutions can be viewed in many different ways. Different authors have different views of what an institution is, but it has moved away from what you might refer to now as an organization, something that probably has an address and its own building structure, to a more liberal definition. I use Streak and Thalen's definition of institutions as formalized rules and structures. So not just organizations, but rules that govern the way individuals or states can behave that have been formalized. Others also may use informal institutions or ideas or norms. I choose not to use them as within my analytical focus, because it starts to make the problem too difficult, as I've put here. By focusing on formal institutions, the study avoids issues of defining institutions in so broad a manner, arguments lose clarity or meaning. So I've chosen a sort of mid-level view of institutions. And because I'm looking at formal rules, it also means that whatever's decided in the UNFCCC can be taken as a change in the institution, as opposed to if there was an idea shift or a norm shift, which is really hard to pin down when or why that's happened. Okay, I'll just quickly go through some of the different perspectives that have been used within this institutionalist body of work. There are three main types that have been deployed. So the first is rational choice institutionalism, which really traditionally has viewed institutions as functional creations. They exist because they have a job to do and they do that job. This also implies that if they no longer do this job properly, then they should rapidly change as actors see that change needs to occur. Okay, these are ideal types of these particular theories. There are different authors that use them in different ways, but broadly, that's how rational choice institutionalism has viewed institutional change and institutional creation. The sociological institutionalists instead hold that a logic of appropriateness guides actors' actions. So it's not about functionalism so much as what's an appropriate thing to do. And so the primary motivator of behavior is not to achieve individual or joint gains, as in rational choice institutionalism, but to act according to mutually constructed norms. Okay. So this goes back into broad arguments in international relations that I won't go into here, but I'd just like to point out that there have been these different approaches. The third approach that has been used a lot is historical institutionalism, which doesn't take as strong a view on a theory of action as the previous two have. Instead, its main feature is that it looks at historical processes to find reasons why things have occurred, how things have unfolded. In particular, it uses path dependency as a mechanism. Once an organization is created, an institution is created, then it becomes very hard to change it once you get lock-in, path dependency, etc. And traditionally, historical institutionalists have used a model of punctuated equilibrium, where a significant change, so an institution that is path dependent, a significant exogenous shock needs to occur for that path dependence to be broken. So, for example, a war or a financial crisis that may completely change the conditions so that change can occur and you can break through that path dependency. Okay. More recently, leading scholars have looked at combining these forms of institutionalism to get a better idea and to loosen the boundaries, theoretical boundaries, away from the more hardline positions that each has taken, let's say. Okay, and that's an approach that I have taken in this thesis as well. However, I will use a historical institutionalist perspective as a starting point. Given that my work is looking over 20 years, it's an appropriate place to start. Often rational and sociological perspectives have sort of chosen a point in time and haven't looked too far back. So I went to a long way back. So as part of my research design, the main method I used was process tracing, which is the main method of historical institutionalists. So this is just going back and taking a very detailed look at what's unfolded and trying to show causal inference for the events that have happened. The key documents I use for this are UNFCCC official documents and reports from the Earth Negotiations Bulletin, which is a service that does very detailed work on negotiations within UNFCCC or any other environmental negotiations. And then to augment this, I also conducted a series of interviews with elites within the negotiations to try and establish things that were happening beneath the surface that obviously was not shown in official documents. So of these interviews, 103 possible candidates were identified, and I tried to contact, where possible, high-level negotiators, and I was largely successful in that. So at the ambassador, special envoy, or director rank, just because they would know best what happened behind the scenes. Given that most of the events I'm looking at were over a decade now, it also made it easier to get the information as these things have become less secret or less tightly held. Through this process, there was found to be a relatively small pool of negotiators that were working in this space, and they all knew each other quite well. So that served to sort of to limit the possibility that I might not be getting the full amount of information, and to give the study more robustness. And I also sought to get geographical diversity from these participants, as well as developing country diversity. Okay, so that's my theoretical approach and research design, briefly. Now we'll go through my findings, which make up really the bulk. I mean, findings, empirical research makes up the bulk of the thesis, and that's really just detailing what happened over this long period of time. So there were 5 chapters dedicated to this, so 50,000 words. I'm not going to give you a blow-by-blow summary of what happened, but I will go through the main forces and mechanisms of change that led to the establishment of the Green Climate Fund. And I've just got a figure here from the thesis that sort of summarizes what I see as 2 or 3 main periods within this 2-decade time frame. We have a period of gradual change that happens over many years after the initial establishment of the UNFCCC, and then eventually you get a transformational change when the Green Climate Fund was established. The question is why? So going back to 1990, my research shows that the initial choices that were made during this time conditioned the possibilities for change afterwards. So the Global Environmental Facility was established in 1990 through the World Bank, and it sort of preempted developing country calls for a similar fund that maybe there was more shared governance and was maybe more favorable to them. It's essentially one of the main factors that allowed the Global Environmental Facility to be the main global model was France and Germany putting forward $100 million as part of its setup. Developing countries were sort of compelled to agree by this. They didn't have a lot of leverage, and their arguments in this time were lacking in sophistication as well. when the UNFCCC was established a couple of years later, the Global Environmental Facility was installed as its operating entity. Again, there was much argument around this, but the developing countries did not have a lot of leverage or sophistication in their arguments. And again, as Peter said, during this time, sustainable development was the term du jour, and a lot of developing countries sort of thought that the whole UNFCCC process was somewhat of a developed country trick to get them to not to be able to develop the right to develop. And so any sort of extra sweeteners, many of the developing countries welcomed, and it helped them to sign on. However, in the creation of the GEF, so that's just establishing the initial process. In the creation of the GEF, there were what Pearson, a historical institutionalist, calls gaps. So when the GEF was established, as with many other institutions, there are problems with it that may not be foreseen. The designers may not know what's going to happen over the coming years. This was very much apparent in the Global Environmental Facility. One lead negotiator said to me, to get the convention signed, which was a real developed country interest at that stage, this deal on finance needed to be included. And it was in a very vague way. It was never going to be a realistic guide to what happened or what was going to be implemented. And as time went on, it became clear that climate change was a huge problem and that substantial change would be required. It became less and less likely that the deal would be implemented. Okay, so there was a lack of understanding of what was coming next when it was created. There was also the political issues that I've just discussed. There were winners and losers in the creation of the GEF. So what these gaps imply is that there will be political contestation going ahead because there is an imperfect creation of the institution at the beginning. Okay, so it serves as a basic mechanism for change going forward. And this political protest and argument did go on. This is well represented by a quote by the Philippines lead negotiator. This was in 2008. Year after year, COP after COP, decision after decision on guidance reiterate the same and similar difficulties encountered by developing countries on funding, in particular as concerns access, the application of the incremental cost concept, greed for costs, etc., etc. So developing countries were very unhappy over many years with the Global Environmental Facility. Because of the way it had been designed, the consensus rules of the UNFCCC, the donor power over the way that it was run, they were unable to change it. So I argue that while these gaps are present and political protest does occur, you do not see fully fledged change. Instead, you see tinkering around the edges. In the timeline I've got included here, you can see there were around the 2000s, several other smaller funds are created at the behest of the developing countries to try and fill in some gaps, particularly around adaptation. However, I argue that these did not significantly alter what is the institutional core, mainly because the size of these funds is very small. Comparatively, it wasn't a lot of money. And also because they fell within the remit of the GEF. So a lot of their governance structures were also the same as the GEFs. And several negotiators that I spoke to referred to them as softs or ad hocery that were used to get deals done at a certain time. So they didn't really change the institutional core. And so I characterize this as relative stability or incremental change. Okay, moving on into the mid-2000s. Again, as Peter said, you've introduced me very well. The balance of global emissions began to shift. China and India became much more important players. And as such, they were no longer so much free riders, but became important political actors within the climate regime. And furthermore, the science of climate change became more certain, and became an increasingly large political issue, on not just in the climate regime, but in all sorts of political fora, United Nations General Assemblies, G20 meetings, etc. Meanwhile, another UNFCCC report estimated that climate finance figures would need to be far larger than what was already flowing, going up to 2030. And also other entities outside the UNFCCC, particularly private entities, started providing climate finance as mitigation became a profitable enterprise, or particularly around solar and wind, etc. And so this shifted the cooperation problem. There became a real need to get developing countries on board in terms of emissions reduction if the world was to remain within a 2-degree temperature increase. Howard Bamsey, who I interviewed for the thesis, put it as such: I think the notion that somehow the developed world alone could solve the problem by taking action and the developing world need not, that began to be disturbed by analysis and facts. The initial response to this by the developed countries was to create another new organization within the World Bank called the Climate Investment Funds. So this organization was again much larger than the GEF. It had a lot of money, and it could, in some ways, respond functionally to the climate change finance problem by providing concessional finance to developing countries and trying to mobilize emissions reduction in developing countries. It served that functional purpose, and even now, a lot of developing country members think the CIFS it's a useful body and it has done a lot of good work. However, while it could serve that functional role, it undermined trust in the negotiations and didn't assist in what was the main game now for developed countries, and that was getting developing countries on board with emissions reductions through serious pledges. Okay, so this sort of summarizes that middle period, and you'll note here, so the gaps still remain from early on in the evolution of climate finance. They have not been closed. However, now changes in power distribution and exogenous shifts have also been added to drivers of change. So when I talk about exogenous shifts, this is as opposed to an exogenous shock that we spoke about before. So a war or a global financial crisis are good examples of exogenous shocks. Within the climate regime, it hasn't really occurred in this exogenous shock model. It's been more of a slow unfolding process. Things like IPCC reports or the Stern report may have been small shocks, but ultimately it's been a slow unfolding process, I argue. And this assists in building pressure for change. However, we still don't have full transformational change. The same system was still present during these years, and we're talking about 2005, 2007. And these were particularly hard years in the climate regime because the US was an active blocker, really. The Bush administration was not helpful at all. George Bush wouldn't even admit that climate change was a real thing in public forums. And the pledge stated that the climate regime had ossified. So this is a real period of trouble. The Kyoto Protocol had entered into force, but it was now considered pretty weak. It didn't cover a lot of countries, and those countries' emissions reduction targets were minimal or relatively minimal. So it's during this period that in my research I observed an increasing acceptance of necessity for reform from many actors within the climate regime, and they start looking for particular solutions to this problem: how to get the US involved again, how to get developing countries involved. And finance becomes a major mechanism through which that can happen. This can also be referred to as an endogenously created crisis point, right? So dovetailing with the idea of a exogenous shift, crisis is generated endogenously within the system rather than it being a shock from outside. How can actors come together to create a crisis? And initially, Copenhagen was the focal point that was created to try and overcome this crisis. So a lot of energy, a lot of time, a lot of political will was put into Copenhagen to try and make this change happen. So I'll just identify some of the mechanisms that were used by actors to create a focal point and a crisis. So in particular, there were my thesis identified some ideas and entrepreneurs that were very important in causing institutional change. One of those was Felipe Calderon, who from a very young age actually had an interest in climate change and trying to solve the problem. And he stepped in as a leader, president of Mexico, leader of a middle country that could sort of bridge the divide between developed and developing countries, and suggested the creation of a new fund, the Mexican Fondo Verde. Felipe Calderon was able to convince others, particularly Gordon Brown, but other Europeans, that a new fund was a good idea. Meanwhile, within the European Commission, there was a lot of analysis being done around how much money would be required going forward for developing countries in order for them to meaningfully participate in the emissions reduction problem. And so the European Commission started putting out papers around the idea of a $100 billion figure to be delivered each year by 2020, and started trying to canvass support around that. They got a lot of support from Gordon Brown again and the United Kingdom, and Gordon Brown quite forcefully started pushing this idea and speaking to other leaders. Now, this was all rather separate to the actual climate negotiations. So while Gordon Brown was much supportive of this idea, the actual United Kingdom delegation or the European delegation did not have formal support for this idea or for a new fund. So these world leaders sort of started skirting around the existing process in Copenhagen. Meanwhile, the United States changed administration, which became a very important thing because Obama made climate change a part of his platform. In an interview with a lead financial negotiator for the United States, he actually identified the moment when the Green Climate Fund, from his perspective, became a reality. Because in negotiations, all the developed countries before this point had said, no, we will use existing channels, we will use existing organizations to finance. We don't need a new fund. We're not going to agree to it. However, at negotiations a month before the Copenhagen conference, the United States changed their position, and this interviewer cited the Obama administration. Our basic feeling was you can't beat something with nothing. The idea for such a fund was a reaction to a legitimately motivated, but politically and practically unworkable proposal from the G77. So having Obama back in the White House was vital for change here, and several interviewees from both developed and developing countries said they don't think that the Copenhagen Accord, even what was done there, and Cancun could have happened if there was no friendly regime in the United States. So these leaders, entrepreneurs, and ideas became quite important in sort of circumnavigating the existing ossification and unproductive path dependence that was occurring in the current regime. So at Copenhagen, you had quite a spectacle of world leaders negotiating in back rooms amongst each other, and they had the ability to go beyond what your standard negotiators could do. So Hillary Clinton walked in and said, yes, we will provide $100 billion per year by 2020, or mobilize $100 billion. And after Hillary Clinton said that, that was it, according to several interviewees. These leaders had the power that negotiators had never had. They also didn't understand the process of how these things should go. And so that caused a lot of issues, and largely the Copenhagen Accord was a failure of process, according to many studies, right? But it was a success through these mechanisms of pushing the finance agenda forward. Suddenly, a new fund was agreed. $100 billion was agreed. But it ended in disaster because it was agreed at the political level. Obama came out waving a paper and said, we've agreed, we've solved it. However, it hadn't gone through the proper COP process. And when it went back to the COP, several parties denied the agreement. And in the consensus rules of the COP, you need everyone to agree. So from there, the task the following year was for the Mexicans, who were taking over in 2010, to try and get this thing back together and put substance onto the political deal that had been made. They were successful in that. Many interviewees were full of praise for the Mexican presidency and the way that it handled things process-wise, which was a major factor in getting change to happen. But also there was what others referred to as a growing maturity within the climate change negotiations, and parties started to look towards compromise. So a lead negotiator for the LDCs called finance architecture and the Green Climate Fund the second best. So the second best is a term in economics that means when actors can't get their first best solution, in order to get agreement amongst parties, they say, okay, let's take a step back and accept a second best solution. And ambiguity was also used within these agreements to try and move things forward. So rather than being very specific about what was going to happen next, they would kick the can down the road a little bit. Or as in this quote from the Copenhagen Accord, in the context of meaningful mitigation actions and transparency on implementation, developed countries commit to a goal of mobilizing jointly $100 billion a year by 2020 to address the needs of developing countries. The term mobilizing within that text carries a lot of weight because nobody actually knows what it means. Does it mean public monies? Does it mean private monies? What is counted within that term? So using that kind of terminology allowed countries to go back to home and say, yes, we've got an agreement. We're going to get $100 billion, so. Or for the alternately developed countries to go back and say, yes, we got an agreement. It's $100 billion. However, this money is not all coming from our own coffers. So my thesis points to this series of factors as being important in reaching a shared social imperative on how to come to an agreement, particularly on finance up to this point. I also discussed within the thesis that what finance then meant for the rest of the agreement and how it, assisted parties in coming to an agreement at Paris. So finance was sort of a first step, a first pillar, or an untying of a Gordian knot. I've heard it put as the Gordian knot was an impossible knot that no one could get undone in Greek times until someone came with a sword and just chopped it, rather than trying to untie it. So it became an alternative outside the box method of overcoming a seemingly intractable problem. So in sum, what my thesis argues is that all of these drivers of change that built up over 2 decades were required to eventually lead to transformational change. The gaps from early on, changes in power distribution throughout the 2000s as emissions profiles changed and GDPs changed, the exogenous shift of climate change becoming more and more of a problem, and an existential threat, and then eventually this endogenously created crisis. So actors realizing that something needs to be done and searching for innovative ways to overcome their problem. So in short, transformational change required a series of causative factors that emerge through time. And these changes can't be neatly explained through a single institutionalist perspective, going back to the theoretical frameworks at the start. I needed to use insights from each to come to a well-rounded view. And there's a quote from Pearson from 2004, where he points out that often transformational change it comes from a long build-up of pressure rather than an exogenous shock. So my thesis is in agreement with Pearson on that in this particular case study. And just to finish, the contributions that my thesis offers is to add to the growing literature that uses institutionalism within IR and within global environmental politics, a relatively nascent field. Empirically, it offers a comprehensive account of the history of the UNFCCC financial mechanism over this period, something that has not been done elsewhere. There have been some accounts of the climate regime more broadly, but nothing so specific to the financial mechanism or climate finance. To also assess the linkages or contribute to the scholarship of assessing linkages between climate finance and the rest of the regime. And hopefully to add to a small body of literature that uses interviews from climate negotiators in analyses. These are relatively few, and I hope to add some insights in that space. And just some references for those who are interested. Great. Alexi.
Practically unworkable.
Well, the main issue that the G77 and the developed countries have over a possible new fund was whether it fell under the authority of the COP or the guidance of the COP. So under the authority, and the COP for others is the Conference of Parties, which is sort of the governing body of the UNFCCC, where decisions have to go through. So the G77 wanted it to be under the authority of the COP, which meant that the COP would have ultimate power over the new fund's structure, its new direction, everything. And the developed countries thought, this is just completely unworkable. How can we try and govern an institution or an organization by 196 party, you know? Just as an aside, a very a president of a country who turned out to be important in these processes, he said, or reportedly said, on his faith in multilateral negotiations, I can't even agree with my wife. If I can't agree with my wife, how can we get 196 parties to agree to something? So the developed countries really wanted governance of the fund to be separate at arm's length from the COP, and as much as possible to be interlinked with international financial institutions like the World Bank and the other development banks. They wanted it to be a professional, financial institution, not an arm of the climate negotiations. And that was the main sticking point. And there were solutions devised to come around that to allow a certain COP oversight while still the Green Climate Fund being separate. But yeah, that was the main sticking point. Did that answer your question? Well, just one clarification first, that the 100 billion and the Green Climate Fund, though they're often put together, they were never supposed to be part of the same, or the 100 billion is not supposed to flow through the Green Climate Fund, and that was never a developed country thought. Some developing countries have continued to push that argument, but it was never in the text, and most understandings from negotiators that I spoke to was the Green Climate Fund would be sort of a $10 billion fund. And even in the early proposals from the EU Commission and then Gordon Brown, who followed up with papers, they sort of looked at the 100 billion as being split about $40 billion public monies, $40 billion private monies, and then another 20% from carbon markets, etc., which back in 2009 were a much bigger thing. In terms of reaching that target now, it's again that's a definitional question. Some countries would argue that the figures around $5 billion or $10 billion that's flowing. Others would argue that we've already reached the 100 billion. And it's also somewhat changed since the time that I was researching as well, because back then developing countries really needed extra money for them to follow sustainable development pathways. They weren't the cheap ways to go, whereas with the rise of solar, the cheapness of solar now, it's almost better to go through sustainable, through low emissions pathways than it is through fossil fuels. So it's changed that dynamic around that a bit as well. In terms of, do we need a shock, or how are we going to get to that figure? Is it important? I mean, there's negotiations on what a new figure will be, because we're going to go beyond the 100 billion, but we haven't even reached the 100 billion yet. It's a difficult question to ask. But I don't think we're going to see a big shock that will then cause countries to suddenly pour their money into such a thing. And I would argue, without without doing too much research into the new loss and damage fund and the negotiations around that and what's happening there, I would argue that there is not a lot of leverage around that as compared to the leverage that existed for developing countries around the time of the GCF establishment and before the Paris Agreement. They don't have the same, they can't offer what they could back then in terms of a step change. So yeah, I would have doubts as to how quickly and largely the loss and damage fund will be capitalised.
Thanks, really interesting. I love the you talk about this and give a lot of actually throughout the regime. I was interested in it's kind of the I'm sorry, I'm just curious about your sense of using that as a strategy of saying, there are lots of people who criticize the still not really fit the purpose of this for their purposes. Is there a particular consequence for that of deliberately trying to this is so that you can
Not that I've come across. I think it'd be a pretty risky sort of strategy to be able to predict what would happen. I mean, maybe Peter could comment on this, but I'm not sure whether Copenhagen could have ever succeeded under any sort of circumstance. A few of the parties went in with bad intentions, probably. But certainly it did have that effect. The failure of Copenhagen did help the success in Cancun because many parties didn't want to be seen as wreckers. It did contribute to a sense of greater crisis. And I argue in my thesis as well that it pushed parties to accept compromise because there became a greater imperative, and that was to get an overall agreement rather than to worry about the particular red lines so much.
Great presentation. You spoke about sort of the political exaltation, and I was wondering if there's any evidence saying any indication that actual climate disasters being more frequent, whether they actually well, whether they increases into the after we've seen actual disasters.
Not that I think I remember Llewellyn Hughes did a study on sort of public perceptions and belief in climate change or priority of climate change following large disasters. And his results depressingly showed that for the first few months afterwards, people would have a heightened sense that something needs to be done, but then that would fade pretty quickly. But I mean, speaking to in some of the interviews from negotiators, whether their view on this is accurate or not, but they would say, Typhoon Haiyan came through before the negotiations, and that really created a sense of urgency or that sort of thing. So I think these things have to affect people in some ways, but the negotiating processes and the structures that are in place and are very, I think, can be very rigid, especially because often negotiators get their instructions from the minister in charge weeks beforehand or whatever, and they've got their mandate, and that's their mandate, and their minister is not paying attention after that. They just say, this is what you can do, this is what you can't do. See you in a month. You know? So that makes it hard.
When you have that slide,
Mhm.
one of the ways questions to get back to
Mm.
just like, you know, the notion of genetically we are number. The question is for the so the gap wider.
Well, I'd say they are drivers of political contestation, but they're also opportunities for parties to argue for one particular form of institution over another. And what was the second thing you said? I had another comment on something you said. I mean, the main argument my thesis makes around gaps is that the early design of the GEF was littered with problems, and that serves as a basic motor for change from the developing countries. They were never happy with it. And so the seeds of change were really sown right from the beginning. However, that's necessary and sufficient conditions. Yeah, I argue that these conditions were all necessary, but none individually was sufficient. Obviously, I can't say these are all definitely necessary. But yeah, I think I put forward a strong argument that each of the conditions were necessary to get this sort of change happen.
Brilliant. On behalf of everyone here, great presentation. Thank you. I'd like you all join in again congratulating. I think this is going to be a good one. Very nice.
Yeah. Huh?
Yeah, I mean, there's one of them.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's what I said. Oh no, I don't. Thanks, John. Yeah, me too.